September 1944, the men of King Company, 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines, had been on Peleliu for 5 days. After the slaughter on the beaches and the airfield, they were pulled back to the southern claw of the island for what passed for a rest. Their assignment was to guard Purple Beach and patrol the swamps, hunting for Japanese trying to slip past the American lines. It should have been a quiet interval, but Peleliu had no quiet intervals, only different kinds of terror. On September 21st, Lieutenant Ed Jones, known to his men as Hillbilly, led a 40-man patrol into the heavy undergrowth north of Purple Beach. The men moved in single file, tense and watchful. They had a Doberman Pinscher war dog with them to sniff out the enemy. One of the NCOs told a private that these mutts could smell a Jap 50 yards away. They set up for the night in a captured Japanese bunker near the swamp. The mortar crew dug their gun pit in the soft dirt. The darkness that fell was absolute, and the tension coiled in every man like a spring. After midnight, a low moan rose from one of the foxholes. The sound grew louder, more desperate, until it became a blood-curdling shriek. A Marine's nerves had snapped. He lashed out at his comrades, screaming that the Japs were going to kill him. A corpsman gave him morphine, then another shot, but nothing worked. The man only screamed louder, punching and kicking. In desperation, another Marine grabbed a trenching tool and swung it hard against the man's head. There was a sickening thud, like a rotten coconut thrown against a concrete wall. The screaming stopped. The man was dead. At dawn, the men gathered around the command post and stared at the poncho-covered body. The patrol commander called Battalion and requested permission to bring the patrol in. The battalion commander wanted them to stay, but the lieutenant insisted. The men's nerves were shot, and they hadn't even seen a Jap or fired a shot. A relief column with a tank was sent to guide them back. They returned to the bivouac area in a somber, exhausted silence, carrying the weight of a man killed by his own comrades. When a private got back to the battalion area, he saw a familiar figure waiting for him. It was a pale, tired Marine with bandages covering the lower half of his face. He had been wounded in the chin by a Japanese grenade and evacuated to a hospital ship. But he had sneaked off that ship, bummed a ride back to the beach, and returned to the company. The private demanded, "What in the hell are you doing back here?" He thought. The wounded man would be halfway to the States by now. The wounded man mumbled through his gauze that he just wanted to be back with the guys. It was where he belonged. The private called him crazy, but he could not keep from grinning. The wounded man's return lifted the spirits of every man who saw him, but it also underscored something darker. Even $1 million wound, a ticket off this stinking island, was not enough to make a man abandon his brothers. They were in this together, for better or worse. On September 25th, the company received orders to move north. They loaded onto trucks and drove up the west road, hugging the craggy shore. The road ran in the shadow of the Umurbrogol ridges, well within range of enemy mortars, machine guns, and rifles. The Marines already called it Sniper Alley. When the trucks stopped, the men dismounted and began walking. Several Sherman tanks rumbled up to provide cover. A private, a sergeant, and several others climbed aboard a tank, grateful for the ride. The tank had moved only a few feet when a single shot rang out. Corporal John Teskovich clutched his belly, blood oozing between his fingers. On the other side of the tank, another private yelled that he was hit, his right arm hanging limp. The corpsman looked at Teskovich's wound and shook his head. The slug had gone all through his intestines. There was not much he could do. Teskovich whispered that he guessed he was going to make his old man rich after all, then died a few minutes later. The sergeant turned to the medic and told him to see about the other man. His arm was broken, but he would live. Then he ordered the men to keep moving north. That night, the company dug in along a narrow strip of ground between the ocean and the west road. The company commander warned that they would have visitors before morning. He called for artillery fire on the enemy positions to their front, telling the gunner that his boy's security was more important than a few shells. Just after midnight, Japanese infiltrators came wading through the surf. A corporal shot one at 20 yards, the body flopping backward into the water without a sound. Then two figures materialized out of the darkness and charged directly toward another private's foxhole. At first light, the private discovered the body of PFC William S. Middlebrook lying nearby. He had been shot through the temple by a mistaken comrade. The company commander investigated and ordered the men not to discuss the matter ever again. It was a tragic mistake, he said, one that any of them could have made. The conscience of the man responsible would already punish him enough. That night, September 26th, the company occupied a steep hill overlooking the northern coast. Private Bill Leiden, who had eaten captured Japanese shrimp and condensed milk earlier in the day, was awakened by violent abdominal cramps. He filled empty C-ration cans with his waist and threw them over the cliff. Moments later, furious Japanese screams erupted from below. He had bombed an enemy mess hall dug into the side of the hill. Later that night, infiltrators attacked again in the adjacent company area. A Marine killed a Japanese soldier by jamming a finger through his eye socket. The war had taken another step toward brutality. By dawn on September 28th, the men of 3rd Battalion, 5th Marines had assembled on a narrow strip of sand along Peleliu's northern coast, directly opposite Ngaspas Island. Heavy guns from the battleship Mississippi and the cruisers Denver and Columbus opened fire, sending massive shells rumbling overhead. Marine Corsair fighter planes from the newly repaired Peleliu airstrip joined the attack, blasting Japanese beach positions with bombs, rockets, and machine gun fire. The infantrymen watched the pilots' precision flying with appreciative awe, punching the air with their fists as the low-flying Corsairs pulled out of their dives at the very last second. Just after 9 o'clock, the Amtraks carrying the assault companies lurched forward into the surf. Private Eugene Sledge felt his heart pounding as he squeezed the stock of his carbine and whispered a prayer. The crossing took about 6 minutes. Unlike the D-Day landing on Peleliu, there was no artillery fire kicking up the surf, no machine gun tracers whining past their ears. The only sounds came from the naval barrage moving inland and the Corsairs wheeling overhead. For a moment, the men allowed themselves to hope this one might be easier. That hope died quickly. The beach itself was littered with at least 50 dead Japanese soldiers, most of them victims of the Corsairs' strafing runs. But beyond the sand, the terrain rose into a low coral ridge that ran the length of the island. This ridge was honeycombed with pillboxes and fortified caves, a smaller but no less deadly version of the Umurbrogol. The Marines had to cross an airstrip under fire, then tackle that ridge. 13 tanks led the advance, and the rifle squads followed close behind, working in coordination to silence enemy positions one by one. Corporal R.V. Bergen led his 7-man mortar squad toward a massive gray pillbox jutting out of a coral ledge just a few yards ahead. Their orders set up the 60mm guns on the far side of the bunker. A sergeant had assured them the position was empty. Bergen was not so sure. As he crouched behind a rock, one of his ammo handlers hissed, "Hey, Bergie, I hear nips in there." Bergen crept to a barred vent hole, heard the babble of Japanese voices himself, then jammed his carbine through the bars and emptied his clip into the darkness. Grenades came sailing back out. The squad took cover as explosions peppered the coral around them. Private John Redifer was hit in the forearm by fragments. Bergen called for a tank. When the Sherman rumbled into position, its gunner fired 3 armor-piercing rounds into the pillbox from point-blank range, ripping a 4-foot hole through the concrete. Even then, a Japanese soldier emerged through the dust, arm drawn back to throw a grenade. Several Marines cut him down before he could release it. That was when Corporal Charles Womack stepped forward with his flamethrower. The weapon was a brutal piece of machinery. Heavy fuel cylinders strapped to his back, a long nozzle in his hands, nearly 70 pounds of jellied death. He moved to within 15 feet of the smoking fissure and pulled the trigger. A sharp, sucking whoosh sent a stream of fire roaring into the bunker. The heat was intense enough to sear waves radiating outward. A few screams came from inside, then silence. When Bergen counted the bodies later, he found at least 17 dead Japanese. The sergeant who had called the pillbox empty could only apologize. On the second day of the fighting, Private Bill Leiden's rifle squad was working its way north along a line of caves. Leiden had been on Peleliu since D-Day, and in that time he had learned how to kill the enemy and how to keep from being killed. He had also come to feel almost invulnerable. When he saw 4 Japanese soldiers dash into a cave ahead of him, he raced forward without hesitation and threw a grenade in after them. Several of his squad mates did the same, and 5 or 6 grenades exploded almost simultaneously near the cave's entrance. A dense cloud of dust still swirled around the opening when a dim figure materialized in the smoke and lurched forward. "Here I am, Marine!" The Japanese soldier screamed in perfect English. "Kill me! Kill me!" Layden obliged as fast as he could pull the trigger. He fired an 8-round burst, saw the man's body jerk as bullets tore through him. The soldier stumbled another step or two before he fell and detonated a grenade no more than 5 yards from where Layden stood. The blast knocked Layden cold. When he came to, his cheek and one side of his head were covered with blood, and he could not see out of his left eye. Layden was loaded onto an Amtrak and evacuated to a hospital ship. The island was declared secure by late afternoon, but the cost was steep. In just over 30 hours, 3rd Battalion lost 48 men, 15 killed and 33 wounded. King Company alone had 8 dead and 24 wounded, almost as many as it had lost in the first 13 days of the entire Peleliu campaign. As the survivors waited on the beach for transport back to the main island, Sledge found himself overwhelmed by the horror of what he had witnessed. He turned away from the others, buried his face in his hands, and wept uncontrollably. The Amtraks delivered the men of K 3/5 back to Peleliu's northern shore on the afternoon of September 29th. There was no rest waiting for them. The division commander, General Rupertus, believed the 5th Marines could finish what the 1st and 7th had started. Within hours, the company was marching south toward the Umurbrogol ridges, a jumble of jagged coral peaks that would become their world for the next 2 weeks. On the morning of October 1st, the company worked its way through the broken ground near the Five Sisters. Sergeant Jim McInerney kept warning his men to stay low and keep their heads down. Private Sterling Mace stuffed his pack with extra ammunition for his Browning automatic rifle Bear, then realized he had no room left for the fresh pack of cigarettes he had just opened. He called over to Private Seymour Levy, who squatted a few yards away, and asked if Levy could stash them in his pack. Levy shrugged and took the cigarettes, slipping them into his pack beside his gear. He had been quiet since returning from the hospital ship, his chin still wrapped in a dirty bandage, but he seemed steady enough. A few minutes later, the men spread out along the ridge, taking positions about 10 feet apart. Mace found a spot some 20 yards from where he had left Levy and settled in, cradling his bar against the coral. Silence settled over the line. Mace let his mind drift to his family in Queens, to a baseball game on Pavuvu, to anything that was not this ridge. Then a single shot cracked through the stillness. It was a lone rifle report, not the usual chatter of machine guns or the crump of mortars. Mace tensed, waiting for something more, but nothing came. 15 minutes later, the order came to move forward. Mace stood, stretched, and looked for his friend to get his cigarettes back. He spotted Private Frankie Oshapek nearby and asked where Levy was. Oshapek looked away. "Nobody wanted to tell you," he said. "He got it in the head a while ago. Never had a chance." McInerney walked over and put a hand on Mace's shoulder. He told Mace that Levy had grown restless, hugging the dirt, and had finally raised his head to take a look. A sniper had fired a single round, hitting Levy square in the skull. He died before anyone could move. Mace felt tears stream down his face as he thought about the cigarettes still tucked inside his friend's pack. There was no retrieving them now. The diversionary attack on the Five Sisters began on October 3rd. Massed artillery from the 11th Marines pounded the peaks for an hour before the rifle companies surged up the lower slopes. The men of K 3/5 took 4 of the 5 jagged heights in the first hour, punching through enemy positions with bayonets and grenades. For a brief moment, it looked as though they might crack the Japanese hold on the ridges. Then the enemy fire intensified. Machine guns opened up from adjoining caves, mortars rained down from unseen positions, and the gains evaporated as quickly as they had come. By late afternoon, the company had been forced back to its original jump-off line. Lieutenant Bill Bauerschmidt, the tall Pennsylvania Dutchman who carried his father's World War I pistol, was dead, shot through the stomach by a bullet that came from behind. 20 men from K 3/5 had been killed or wounded. The ridges had taken another payment in blood. In the days that followed, the battle settled into a grinding rhythm of patrols, sniper fire, and cave busting. The stench of death hung over every crevice and gully. Thousands of unburied Japanese corpses rotted in the heat. and the Marines could not escape the smell. Flies rose in black clouds at dawn, so thick that men had to pick them off their rations while they ate. Water was scarce, sleep was measured in minutes, and the constant tension frayed every nerve. On October 5th, the 7th Marines were withdrawn, their ranks shredded beyond usefulness, as the exhausted survivors of I-37 rested near a northern beach. A young black Marine sergeant approached Top Sergeant Bill Mulford. He and his men from an ammunition depot company had finished their work and wanted to volunteer for the front. Mulford warned them they had no idea what they were getting into. The sergeant replied that they could take it. For the rest of the day, the black Marines carried wounded and supplies, and that night they filled foxholes on the line. The next morning, they charged an enemy-held hill alongside what was left of I Company. Mulford, who had initially hesitated, later told an Army soldier who asked about them, "They're some of the best damn Marines you'll ever see." But the 5th Marines stayed in the line. The hardest blow came not from the enemy, but from the order to continue the attack. On October 7th, 3rd Battalion launched a coordinated assault on the Horseshoe Valley, a concave stretch of ground flanked by caves and bunkers. Tanks and flamethrowers supported the infantry, and for a time they pushed deep into the valley. But the Japanese held the high ground on 3 sides, and the fire was too heavy to hold. The company pulled back, having gained nothing but more names for the casualty list. Colonel Bucky Harris, watching the pattern repeat itself, made a decision. There would be no more frontal assaults from the south. He would shift the attack to the north and try a different approach. On the morning of October 10th, Lieutenant Ed Jones faced a problem that had plagued his platoon for days. Hidden Japanese snipers had been firing from the high ground above the West Road, picking off men whenever they moved. Jones decided he needed a better vantage point, so he climbed onto the rear deck of a Sherman tank that had been brought up for support. He leaned around the turret and peered toward the ridge, searching for the enemy gun positions. A single rifle shot cracked across the valley. The bullet struck Jones in the left side below his rib cage, the impact throwing him off the tank onto the coral below. Dazed and bleeding, he pulled himself back onto the deck and rose to his feet. A second shot tore through his chest before he could steady himself. He slumped against the turret and slid to the deck, dead before his body hit the metal. The men who recovered his body found a letter in his pack that he had written to his mother the day before, full of hope about coming home for Christmas. 2 days later, on the morning of October 12th, Captain Andy Haldane led a handful of his senior non-commissioned officers to the crest of Hill 140. The company was preparing to take over new positions, and Haldane needed to see the terrain spread out on the far side of the ridge. He lay flat on his stomach and crawled the last few feet to the ridgeline. He raised his head no more than 4 or 5 inches to glance over the edge. A sniper's bullet struck him squarely in the face with a sharp, wet sound that every man within earshot recognized instantly. Sergeant Dick Higgins, who was only a few feet away, saw the captain's head jerk backward and then flop forward against the coral. Haldane died in that single instant, his skull torn open by the round. The stunned men could not believe their commander was gone. Sergeant Jim McInerney, the senior non-commissioned officer on the ridge, took temporary command and began directing artillery fire against the Japanese positions, knowing the fight had to continue. On the morning of October 13th, the decimated 3rd Battalion launched its final assault in the Umurbrogol pocket. The objective was to straighten the lines around Hill 140, squeezing the remaining Japanese deeper into their shrinking stronghold. The men who made the attack were hollow-eyed and exhausted after nearly 4 weeks of continuous combat. Marine corsairs dropped napalm on the enemy-held ridges facing Hill 140. Turning them into a wall of flame, riflemen from King and Item companies pushed forward into the smoldering gulch at 9:15 and made steady gains against stubborn resistance. By late afternoon, they had pushed the front forward up to 150 yards and held their ground. These were the last Marine infantrymen to fight in the pocket before Army troops arrived to relieve them 2 days later. With their captain dead and their company reduced to less than half its original strength, the survivors of King Company held the line they had taken and waited. They had lost their leaders, but they had not broken. On October 15th, D+30, the men of King Company heard a sound they had almost stopped believing in, the crunch of boots marching in formation from the south. Army troops from the 321st Infantry Regiment filed into the lines, their faces clean and their uniforms crisp. The Marines stared for a moment, then gathered their gear and shuffled toward the trucks waiting on the East Road. There was no cheering, no celebration. The relief was silent and mechanical, a simple exchange of one exhausted group for another. The rest area near the northern coast felt like another world. They showered with real soap, put on clean dungarees, and ate hot chow without flies swarming every bite. On October 29th, the survivors of King Company assembled on Purple Beach for a photographer. 85 men stood in ragged rows, all that remained of the 235 who had landed on D-Day. The camera clicked, capturing a company that had been burned down to a fraction of its strength. 2 days later, they boarded the transport ship Sea Runner and left Peleliu behind. The voyage carried them to Pavuvu, but the island had been transformed. Tents with wooden decks, electric lights, a well-stocked PX, it bore little resemblance to the mudhole they had left in August. At Christmas, they feasted on fresh turkey. In March, a ball field was dedicated to Captain Haldane, a simple sign reading Haldane Field, marking the place where his name would live on. The division shipped out again in spring, bound for Okinawa. The fighting there was larger and longer, but the old habits from Peleliu carried them through. Corporal Bergen took shrapnel in the neck and earned a Bronze Star. Sterling Mace had his eardrum blown out by a close explosion. Layden recovered from his eye wound and returned to King Company in time for the Okinawa campaign, where he was hit by a shell that tore off a finger and peppered his torso with fragments. All survived the island. Of the 53 men who had joined King Company back in Melbourne, only 3 remained on the rolls when Okinawa was secured. The men who came home carried the weight of Peleliu in ways that never fully lifted. Lieutenant Ed Jones was posthumously awarded the Silver Star, and his body was returned from the island for burial with full military honors near his family home in Maryland. John Teskovich died there on Sniper Alley, one of the first to fall as the company pushed north, and his death stayed with the men who saw it. Lieutenant Bill Bauerschmidt fell on the slopes of the Five Sisters, his father's World War I pistol still holstered at his side. Seymour Levy was killed by a sniper's bullet in the ridges, his grave initially marked with a cross instead of a Star of David, a small injustice that haunted his friend Mace long after the war. Jim McInerney, who had held the company together after Haldane fell, returned to New York and later reunited with Mace in Florida, their friendship lasting decades. Eugene Sledge wrote a memoir that became a classic, yet he could never forget the stench of the ridges. Irvi Bergen kept in touch with every surviving member of the company for the rest of his life. Charles Womack, who had carried a flamethrower through both campaigns, settled in Mississippi and still answered to the nickname Red. They were bound not by medals or headlines, but by the simple, unbreakable fact that they had endured together when so many around them had fallen. If you or someone in your family ever carried a rifle in the Pacific War, or if you have a story of a relative who came home from Peleliu, we would be honored to hear it in the comments below. Please take a moment to subscribe to the channel and give this video a like. It helps us continue telling the stories of the men who fought and died in the forgotten battles. Thank you for listening and for remembering them.